Hey everyone, thanks for coming back to day two of the second annual One Country Rural Progress Summit. Today we're going to discuss some of the biggest issues in rural America, including affordable housing, the next farm bill, delivering rural health care, and paid family leave, and what that means for rural America. We're also going to hear from our keynote speaker, Audra Molken, founder of the Female Farmer Project. I'm really excited, and if you do have time, make sure that you tune in for her presentation. She is the producer of the film Women Work: The Untold Stories of Female Farmers. And it's not just in this country, but globally, what women mean to agriculture. As a reminder to the audience, between sessions, you will return to the lobby area and then can select the next scheduled program you want to participate in. You can also visit the virtual expo forum to learn more about our great sponsors who are helping make the Rural Progress Summit possible. And if you miss any of the great panels from day one, or you have a conflict in the next panels, you can view them online anytime. And so our first discussion today is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And I have to tell you, I would suggest to anyone who's concerned about rural America that they get in their car, drive to a small town, and drive through a small town. I was recently in southeast Illinois, driving through rural communities. And I just thought this problem is everywhere. Depleted housing, lack of affordable housing. If you wanted to fix it up, how do you get the financing to fix it up? Because there isn't a robust housing market. These are unique challenges to rural America. And that's why I was so excited. And I'm very excited to welcome our next panelists. Robin Wolf is the Director of Programs with the Enterprise Community Partners. Robin is a community development specialist with over 15 years experience in designing, implementing, and managing successful strategies for community development activities, working with the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Kayla Laywell is a housing policy analyst with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Kayla covers housing supply, fair housing, and rural and Native American housing. Before joining her organization, she worked in the office of Senator Ben Ray Lujan, a great guy and a guy who well knows the challenges of housing in Native communities, and our current head of rural development, Tori Smalls. She is in North Dakota today and asked if I could join her, ironically, and I said, no, I got other conflicts, but she has gone everywhere. And so you come from good stock. Two really great people, Kayla. And so we're going to launch this by just maybe starting out with Robin and Kayla taking turns describing their organization, describing the challenges as they see them. Then we're going to get into a dialogue about, what do we know about rural housing? And then hopefully spend a lot of time at the end talking about solutions. So Robin, can you start us off? That'd be great.
Sure thing, Heidi. Thank you for that. Thank you for the introduction. I'm excited to be here and talk about housing. I think historically in rural communities, we've thought of housing being more affordable in rural spaces. And as you mentioned, as you're driving through, and there's a lot of challenges that are facing rural communities related to housing right now. So I work for Enterprise Community Partners. We're a national nonprofit or intermediary that's focused on affordable housing. And we're approaching affordable housing from a lot of different angles. We actually own and manage over 13,000 affordable units. So actively working on development and management. We invest a tremendous amount of capital through the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program and our CDFI, the Enterprise Community Loan Fund. And then also have the solutions team, which is where I sit. We are actively working to work with local communities on community development strategies, thinking about policy strategies, thinking about technical assistance directly on programs and projects. So working through budgets and financial budgets on how to get a project out of the ground and built, or how to preserve affordable housing units in their community. And also we have direct funding for organizations through HUD Section 4, which is really important, so we can provide some capacity building dollars. And my team specifically, I serve as the director of rural housing, and I sit on the tribal nations and rural communities team. So we're really focused on serving rural communities across the country. And what we've found is that there's a lot of universal challenges, and then there's a lot of uniqueness, right, throughout rural America. As we get into, I live in Denver, Colorado, on the Mountain West. We're more spread out. Rural communities can become very remote, and so the infrastructure access, is particularly as we're talking about tribal communities, broadband access, really big issues. We're talking about rural communities in denser areas like the Northeast. The challenges are different, but still lots of communities are facing, as you kind of alluded to, Heidi, the challenges around aging stock and and in blight. And so how can we think about revitalization, recapitalization, and reinvigoration, as we're looking at all of the issues? So I'm excited to kind of dive deeper into this with you and Kayla as we go forward in the panel today.
Thanks, and hi Heidi. Thank you, Robin. My name is Kayla Laywell. I'm a policy analyst at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I'm glad you started with the shout out to Senator Lujan and former Congresswoman Xochitl Torres Small. New Mexico is where I first started to see these issues, and they're prevalent, right? It's my home state. And looking at the needs of both Native American tribes and rural communities, you see a lot of the similar themes, right? And they require unique solutions, like Robin said. I mean, Native Americans on tribal lands have some of the worst housing needs in the US. They face high poverty rates and low incomes, overcrowding, lack of plumbing and heat, and unique development issues. Despite the growing need for safe, decent homes, federal investments in affordable housing on tribal lands have been chronically underfunded for decades, particularly in more remote and rural areas. When we think about rural communities too, I think there's often some stereotypes, but what do those communities look like, right? Because of higher, more persistent levels of poverty and lower incomes, rural communities often struggle to provide decent, accessible, and affordable rental homes for its residents. Today, far too many rural renters live in unaffordable, overcrowded, and substandard homes. It looks the same, right, as Native American communities. Despite the need, again, federal investment in affordable housing in rural America has been chronically underfunded. And so that's part of what the National Low Income Housing seeks to address. We urge Congress to increase resources to build and preserve affordable rental homes, particularly for people with the greatest needs, as these are the people in rural and Native communities that are most likely to become homeless.
So let's start out by talking about kind of a national assessment. Has there really been a national assessment on where we are with housing? What is the housing stock in what we would consider rural and tribal America, and what the needs are going forward, and how we're going to basically meet those needs? So the first thing that I would ask is, what do we know? I mean, I know you guys are well familiar with the work that you do. You're on the ground every day. I think people would be shocked to learn that the housing crisis in rural America is, in my opinion, worse than the housing crisis in major cities in this country. And so what do we know about, kind of the universe of challenges for rural housing?
I think the aging stock is a big issue, but we also often have some inverted market issues as well. Costs of construction have gone up across the country, right? We're seeing that in metro communities, and we're seeing that in rural communities as well. But rents haven't gone up in the same way. So if we're trying to think about new development and how we project that, and when we do that on a project by project basis, we use like a tool called a pro forma, where we're projecting how much money will come in versus income, and how we can manage that versus debt that we can take on. And when an inverted market, when our rents are lower but our costs are just as high, it's that much more difficult to make something pencil. So new projects are really hard to get off the ground. We're also, the USDA 515 housing stock, which is rural development's housing, housing program, primary subsidized housing program that serves rural America, has 400,000 units right now in its portfolio. 337,000 of those units are set to expire in the next 20 years. We've got to think about how to preserve the
Robin,
subsidies we have.
for people who don't work in housing, can you explain what you
Sure.
mean by expire?
Sure. So, and it is honestly, a lot of folks who work in housing don't know much about USDA Rural Housing Service and how that stock works. We have restricted use covenants or restricted use on those projects, which means that once they were developed using federal money, using USDA money, the 515 program, they have a sunset when their mortgage expires. And what is unique to the USDA 515 program is when the mortgage expires, not only will those units no longer be restricted, but the associated rental assistance, which USDA calls 521, will also expire. So this stock serves, we've got 2/3 of the folks who live in 515 housing are elderly and folks with disability. We also see, I think the average income is $13,600 for individuals living in these housing units. They need vouchers. They need the 521 vouchers to remain in place, and they need the unit. They need the home where they're living. And when we talk, I hate to talk about it as units because the unit is their home, right? That is where they live day to day. And so if the affordability is lost, and if the additional subsidy that we're getting from the USDA is lost, that small town no longer has any subsidized housing.
Right. I mean, I think that it's important to point out how critical this is for maintaining elderly populations in rural America, because they could move into, let's say, Fargo, from Lisbon to Fargo, and be able to access some additional voucher assistance for housing. But if these housing vouchers expire, number one, you may have stranded assets because who's going to live there? And number two, that affordable housing component will evaporate. And so we can talk a little bit about, kind of what you guys are thinking about, making sure that those access still continues. But I want to make the point here is that a lot of these are folks that would otherwise maybe be in a higher level of care, and cost the government even more if they would in fact seek Medicaid services. So they're able to maintain, elderly are able to maintain in these housing units because they're surrounded by family who make sure that they're provided for. They have their doctors, but all of a sudden, if that housing unit is critical to them being able to maintain, maintain themselves in the community. And so, we forget how important this is for, I think, just the morality of housing. Never mind the other thing, Robin, if you could just talk about, if I build a house in Bismarck, North Dakota, and the housing prices are high, okay, I think, well, I may not be able to get a 7% appreciation every year the way I have in the past, but I'm not going to lose money on this house. Talk about the difficulty for single family housing. Talk about the difficulty of financing single family housing in rural America when housing values, the cost of construction may in fact exceed what would be market value.
Well, that's a huge issue, right? So if you're going to build a new home, exactly to your point, Senator Heitkamp, like if you're going to build a new home and it's going to cost more than what it'll appraise for, that puts somebody upside down or underwater at purchase. And that's not that's not a way that we can establish new home ownership opportunities for folks. And it's not even sustainable it's not a good financial move, even if you do have the money to take on the difference that you're not going to be able to pay. And that's just gotten exacerbated as interest rates have increased over the last year. So when we were at lower rates, right, in the threes, that we could take on more capital investment. And now when we're at higher rates, 5.75 into the sixes, that really changes our anybody's buying power and what they're able to pay month to month. And incomes have not kept up with kind of the rise in prices. So we're seeing fewer and fewer housing opportunities. The homes that are affordable that we're seeing, there's lots of single family stock in rural America, but the homes that are affordable have significant deferred maintenance and so need a lot of work.
Well, and that work's going to cost as lumber prices go up, as labor prices go up. If you can find someone to hang some sheetrock, good luck,
Right.
And so the other point that I want to make is, at the same time that we're doing this, because of the housing crisis of 2008, the scrutiny regulators are going to put on, borrowing money to someone who, is not going to appraise at market value. It's just tight. Credit is a huge problem. And as credit costs go up and building costs go up, it is reaching crisis proportions. Kayla, in the work that you do, what would you say is your top 3 concerns that you have right now, where you want to rip your hair out because it's like this should be done, but it's so simple. If they would just give me some opportunity to address these concerns, we could do a lot better.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time not equating with opportunity with money, because that's what's needed, right? Is long-term investments. The underlying cause of America's housing and homelessness crisis is the severe shortage of homes available to people with the lowest incomes. NLIHC's most recent gap report found that there's a shortage of 7.3 million homes that are affordable and available to renters with the lowest incomes, and rents are far higher than what these households can afford. So NLIHC's Housed campaign has 4 big solutions to America's housing crisis, and we believe that these would address the roots of housing affordability crisis. First, we need to bridge the gap between incomes and housing costs by expanding rental assistance. We need to expand and preserve the supply of affordable, accessible rental homes, and provide emergency rental assistance to help stabilize families in crisis. I think the COVID-19 pandemic showed what good emergency rental assistance can do, and families are still struggling, right? We have eviction moratoriums, emergency rental assistance that has stopped, and in many communities stopped completely, and families are still in need. And finally, we need strong, enforceable renter protections. While USDA's rural housing service includes rental assistance, a lot of rural renters rely on HUD programs like Housing Choice Vouchers to find affordable housing. Congress really needs to invest in expanding HUD and USDA's rural rental assistance, invest in the Housing Trust Fund to build more deeply affordable housing, and create a permanent emergency rental assistance program to help stabilize families when they face eviction. Building more affordable housing is critical, and renters would be able to access more of this housing if strong renter protections were enacted. Things like source of income discrimination protections, just cause eviction standards, and other tenant protections to keep families from being displaced.
Yeah, the one thing I want to talk about is the intersection between this affordability issue and homelessness. Homelessness is getting a lot of attention, mainly because of what's happening in San Francisco, LA, all the major metro areas. But how many of those people have been driven to a major metro area because they couldn't find affordable housing where they live, where they would have family support? And so let's talk a little bit about kind of all of this now hyper attention, I think, nationally to homelessness, how maybe the root cause of this, which is the lack of affordability of housing, is kind of getting ignored as we try and put Band-Aids on the symptoms, which I think is in fact this growth. It's not all of it, but certainly it's a huge component of what we're seeing right now with homelessness is affordability of housing. You guys.
Yeah. And I will say homelessness can look different in rural communities, right? I often what we see is overcrowding, and so those are folks at risk of homelessness. If you're couch surfing or staying, or we've seen in rural communities and in tribal communities upwards of 13 people living in one single family home, and so that looks different. We might not see it on the street as we're driving through a rural community, but there are definitely folks without a stable housing that are living in rural America. And so really thinking through what are the solutions that we need to think about solutions for rural America and not just for our cities and our urban centers. And some of that can even think about policies on the local level that we can enact. Is there a way to reduce density or increase density and reduce the restrictions on density? When a lot of rural America has one home per acre kind of restriction, that's very spread out, right? At the least, like, could we find ways to put on accessory dwelling units? Are there ways to think about removing barriers and policy barriers at the local level that could help us ease the problem? Also, I mean, from a pure supply and demand standpoint, the more supply, the more affordable housing that's created, it'll affect the entire spectrum of housing need, right? So if we can adequately house our teachers in rural America, then they have their own homes, and then again, then somebody else can move into the apartment that has been subsidized, and we have more ability and more spectrum for everybody to have a safe, decent, and affordable place to live. So I think that we've got to think about it from supply side. And then also, I do want to note that we do have homelessness in our rural communities. We just don't see it. It just expresses itself in different ways, but it's still deeply affecting those households, those children who are living in overcrowded homes. And it's really deeply affecting folks in rural communities as well.
Yeah, and it doesn't frequently get counted, because if you are in a subsidized housing unit, you can only have so many people in that unit.
Mm-hmm.
And now all of a sudden, and this is really a challenge in Native communities, as you look at extreme overcrowding in the units that are still habitable. And the undercounting that comes as a result of regulations saying you can only have 4 people in this unit, but yet they have, off and on, maybe 10 people who come and go into that unit. Kayla, if you look at kind of homelessness, especially in Native American communities, how come it is that we haven't been able to adequately address the challenges, and what are some of the barriers to finding affordable housing, whether it's in a community that they move to? Let's take Spirit Lake. Doesn't have to be in Fort Totten. It can be in Devil's Lake, but it has to be affordable and it has to be available. What are some of the challenges that unique population has in securing affordable housing?
Yeah, homelessness in Native American communities it's critical, right? I think Robin mentioned 13. I think especially in the Northern Plains, Southwest in New Mexico and Alaska, we see some of the worst rates of Native American homelessness. And it's an issue of, similar themes in rural America too, right? High development costs, limited infrastructure. And I think a critical component is the NAHASDA reauthorization, the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act. It hasn't been reauthorized in 10 years now, and that critical funding is what would help Native communities build their own housing and support, the unique needs of each community. The issue of homelessness is, I think, what is an emotional topic for many people, right? And what makes it so agitating for me is when many communities don't realize that homelessness is a housing problem, and they try addressing homelessness with criminalization or mandatory treatment programs. Homelessness is a housing problem. Addressing the housing supply and creating targeted rental assistance, targeted treatment programs for communities that need it. So combining that with Native American communities, I think addressing tribal sovereignty and empowering communities to have the resources they need to meet the needs they have.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time working on NAHSDA without much success when I was in the Senate, and it's a program that was designed for self-determination, but it number one, the biggest problem is it's underfunded. And there's too much demand. And then, how it's divided, there is some resources there that could be reallocated, but that gets into some tribe to tribe politics. And so the challenges are many. It's interesting. I chaired a panel yesterday on rural broadband and economic development. And I just kept saying, look, you've got to create communities where people want to live. That's that now we're so familiar with the challenges of workforce in America, so familiar with the challenges of companies will go where the workforce is, but we've got to create an opportunity for people to live a quality of life in communities, or they're not going to stay in those communities. And so let's talk about kind of the infrastructure problems, whether it is broadband, whether it is making sure that it's curb and gutter with lights, and by the time you put all of that together, you've got lots that now are at outrageous amounts. So a lot that I mean, you're starting out with $40,000 of embedded costs before you even pound a nail or pour concrete. And so these are expanding housing in rural America is really challenging. And so can you talk about what programs work for building infrastructure, and how are they being targeted, whether it's through the new dollars that have come through the infrastructure bill, whether it is typical dollars coming out of the Farm Bill for rural development, where is that infrastructure assist that we need so badly?
Yeah, I mean, I think RD has some rural development, USDA's rural development program has a lot of good infrastructure loans and programs that can help access, that rural communities can access. I think there's also local policy that can happen that can help to access infrastructure. We're seeing some communities annex in, adjacent land, so that they can bring them into the infrastructure, into the water tap that's for the city sanitation, for example, and that can be supported with rural development dollars. It can also be supported with CDBG dollars, and rural communities are non-entitlement communities, and the way that HUD puts out dollars, the entitlement communities have a population threshold, and rural communities don't meet that threshold. But there is a balance of that goes and is normally held at the state level. And so really having a knowledge of being able to access those programs and proactively asking for those dollars to be leveraged in could be used. A perfect example is could be used for the curbs and sidewalks in front of housing developments. And so making sure that we're accessing all the dollars, not just focusing on dollars available from rural development. There are dollars available from HUD, and rural communities should step up and claim those dollars. And so really thinking through, like I said at the top, project by project, what is available at the state level. A lot of states right now have still have money available, recovery money. And so making sure that that's getting out into rural communities. And the best way is to have our rural communities assert themselves and say, we need this money here. This is the project. Because often what happens is we don't get in line because we don't have a project in place. And so therefore all the money gets used before we're able to put it in place in our community. So I'm really excited. Rural development has some great programs, but I don't think we can solely rely on those. We're going to have to think about layering a lot of different resources to get to an end development. And there are many that we're not taking full advantage of in rural communities.
Kayla, what about infrastructure? What about, this high lot cost, this high kind of development cost before you even begin to construct the units? You just have a lot of additional challenges.
Yeah, I love Robin's point about, rural communities using a creative and all hands on deck approach to get as many resources as possible for investing in infrastructure in their communities. I mean, on its own, the private market cannot and will not build and operate homes that are deeply affordable to extremely low income families. Only a sustained public commitment of funding targeted to serve people with the lowest incomes will ensure that that they have accessible and affordable homes. That said, the low-income housing tax credit is the largest affordable housing production program in the United States. And while it's a primary source of financing for construction and preservation of affordable housing, homes financed solely with LIHTC are very rarely affordable to renters with the lowest incomes. I mean, LIHTC rarely meets the needs of rural and tribal communities. There are a few opportunities for action with that, though. I mean, Congress should advance bipartisan reforms to LIHTC that would better serve rural and tribal communities. which, as we've noted, faced higher poverty rates, lower incomes, overcrowding, homelessness in a different way. Tribal nations have the most severe housing needs in the United States. We already talked about overcrowding, unreliable plumbing and heat infrastructure. And so by designating rural and tribal communities as difficult to develop areas, as proposed in the Bipartisan Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, Congress could allow this already successful program of LIHTC accessible to rural and tribal communities.
Yeah, I mean, and for those of who are watching who are uninitiated in all this alphabet soup, let me tell you, some of the most complicated interactions that I saw when I was in the Senate was in the housing space. It's just way too, well, we could use this program, but that this regulation won't work for this program. We could use that program. And in the meantime, we've got all these great programs, but still no, I mean, we have a housing crisis, not just urban, but we have a rural housing crisis. So these programs are not working. Let's at least say they're not working to basically deal with the magnitude of the problem. They're great programs. They've worked well in the past, but as we kind of look at the new needs, whether it is a blended family, whether it is a Native American family, whether it's a runaway or homeless youth who need to have a place. I mean, we've got populations that have unique issues. And then we have the need for transitional housing, a big part of which is that opportunity to get back on your feet, not just go from a program that may help you get sober to back to the community, but a place where you can transition. Now, there's a lot of thinking about whether those programs work the way they should work. And so we've got this huge challenge. I guess I want to turn to state governments because probably something you don't know about me is I served on the board for the North Dakota Housing Finance Agency. And so we spent a lot of time. I'm going to tell you a story. Sarah Vogel and I, who were the majority members of the Industrial Commission, which ran the Housing Finance Authority, we asked them to do just one thing, and that was make sure that they did first-time homeowners on reservations. 8 years. Sarah was with me for 4, and Roger Johnson was with me for the other 4. Roger Johnson, who was the national chair of the National Farmers Union, was ag commissioner at the time in North Dakota. During that time period, they did not do one first-time homeowners on reservations in North Dakota. So, in spite of having repeated table pounding from leadership, and it just. Sometimes states do the easy thing, not the creative, hard thing. Can you, in the states that you work with, can you kind of point out a state that really is doing good things, has a real handle on what their housing needs are, and is developing strategies? Because I think a lot of this is going to be state-led. The federal government's going to create these programs to fill niches, but overall kind of universal state planning is going to be led by governors, it's going to be led by mayors, it's going to be led by county commissioners. Can you tell me where the states are doing a good job right now, and what would be a good model for kind of expansion of those ideas to other states? Robin?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll let Kayla go first since she raised her hand there.
I was going to point to you, NLHC doesn't do a ton of state level work. I think just looking at which models have worked nationwide is investments in housing, housing first to address homelessness, and just creative ways to use federal government resources to actually make sure that is meeting the needs, which is the lack of.
But I will tell you this, Kayla, North Dakota had millions of dollars for homelessness and for housing. They sent it back. So a state can, if a state is not prepared for these federal programs, if they're not prepared, I think, Robin, you said this, like, where is the planning right now that allows rural communities to, boom, the minute the resources they're ready with a plan and with a shovel to make this happen? I think you're going to see that all over the country, states having not been ready, in spite of this being one of the most critical entry points for families who are struggling to make sure that they have affordable housing makes all the difference in the world. You know, that you can't study if you're couch surfing. You can't study. I mean, here's a great example. I had a bus driver at on Spirit Lake who told me he had a young 8th grader who every day when he got on the bus carried a Sterilite box, you know, one of those totes, because he didn't know where he was going that night when he got off the bus. Can he do well in school when he's worried about, you know, where he's going to eat that night and where he's going to sleep that night? Absolutely not. And so, you know, that if you aren't going to do it for any other reason, think about all the young children out there that don't know where they're going to go that night. And the states, I don't think, have done a good enough job in collaborating with each other and in creating viable, realistic, long-term housing strategies. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong.
I know I work on specific projects. I work with specific communities, public housing authorities, and nonprofits who are trying to either get a program off the ground or preserve. A lot of my day-to-day work is working on actively preserving existing subsidized stock through the 515 program. And different states have different levels of engagement, and we're able to engage in different ways. I sit in Colorado, so I know a lot about what Colorado has done. No state is perfect, but I think that they have made a lot of efforts to really use the money that they got, you know, that for homelessness and housing. I will say it doesn't always get out as much as we would like to rural communities because, again, the rural communities, these projects are very complicated. We are going to need a low-income housing tax credit and figuring out, making sure there's a basis boost, Kayla, to your point, as we have in the Improvement Act, to make sure that some of that gets out to rural communities. But then that's going to have to be layered with the CDBG and the ERAP money, or the, you know, all of these different kinds of programs that you have that are at the state's disposal. And so states really thinking about a comprehensive solution that uses all of those sources.
Robin, I just want to point out, so in a county in North Dakota, housing may fall with rural development. They already are overwhelmed by trying to figure out all these programs. And when you say, oh, well, you could layer this with this, you know, it takes a lot of education. And again, the workforce that is required to prepare a community to, you know, use those resources. Isn't it easier to just kind of think about one point of entry for housing in rural America? That I mean, you know, why do they have to layer anything? Why can't they just go to one place and say, this is my needs, this is what the community is willing to invest, this is what the city's willing to do in terms of specials, you know, and financing specials, take that burden on themselves, which is the infrastructure challenge that we have for greenfield development, right? So how do we get through the alphabet soup to actual results? I guess is my challenge.
Right. I think that's I hear what you're saying, and I do think that for me, day to day, again, it's the technical assistance and having technical assistance available. Right now, USDA does have a technical assistance program on 515 preservation. To your point, there's different states that are paying for active TA for rural communities. Again, in Colorado here, the Colorado Housing and Finance Agency has a SHIP program that is small housing. It is a small housing program focusing on small, mid-size, because they knew that their LIHTC projects weren't really reaching those communities. So how could they set them up to access low-income housing tax credits? I think those are going to be key. Having the states think about putting in a state tax credit that meets the 4% so that there's a larger balance of dollars coming into the development. And it would be great if we could go back and say, okay, USDA, let's fund a whole development soup to nuts. But with a $70 million budget per year for the balance of the nation, we are going to have to leverage private dollars into the deal. And right now, the best tool we have for doing that is the low-income housing tax credit program. And so really it is, can we have a broader technical assistance, folks like my team that can go out and work directly? I'm working directly with tribes in California right now to access dollars, home key dollars that have been made available at that state. It's not easy, it's complicated, but I hope that once we get through, you know, the tribe that I'm, the 6 tribes we're currently supporting, if we can help them get through this for their first development, maybe they'll be ready to do low-income housing tax credit development. And so I wish it were 100%. I wish it were easier. I do wish we could, that we no longer have a way to fund, though, the 515 like kind of subsidized stock with the rental assistance all together, and we would get 2 projects built with that $70 million.
And Robin, frequently the management of, I mean, I can speak from some experience on this on 515, it really relies on communities to have a high level of engagement. And when the community, kind of like, oh, well, we've always been the board, and then all of a sudden they're in crisis and they're saying, look, you have not met your requirements. We're going to withdraw your subsidization. I mean, that hits the panic button. And so I don't want to say that there aren't people capable, but it is just, if you can make, $50,000, working at the local bank, or $50,000 learning all this and trying to, get housing, you may say, look, that complicates my life beyond complication. And Robin, what I would say is, I wish there were 5,000 of you. There aren't 5,000 of you, right? I mean, how many people are doing the kind of work that you're doing, and you've got to be selective in terms of the projects that you're taking on. And Kayla, what do you think about this issue of training workforce in states and counties to be better able to access, number one, access the resources that are there, but to your point, because a lot of what you do is advocacy, to be your, to knock on the door of the senator and say, this is what's happening. And it's not the local community development block grant people, it's the mayor. It's the county commissioner who, was a big buddy of theirs when they were doing other stuff together, when the person was governor or secretary of state or attorney general. I mean, I think that, in terms of housing advocacy, it's like here it's the same cast of characters and we get the same result in Washington, because we don't bring in people who are committed, who have past relationships.
Yeah, I mean, I experienced that in southern New Mexico when it was, the city council has their own full-time job, and they're also trying to apply for these grants. I've been inspired by the Rural Partners Network and other initiatives by USDA to get awareness about these programs out. I also know that it'll take a lot of outreach, from the federal government and a lot of community-based organizations to make sure they're aware and actively applying for these programs. And using advocacy, state and local, connecting to their members of Congress and other, executive administration officials to make sure that they're aware of which programs are working, and when they're not, how to fix them. I mean, NLIHC works really closely with our state and tribal partners to make sure that Congress is aware, hey, this Indian housing block grant isn't working, or this program needs to be fixed in this way.
Yeah. Paul Goodiron, who you may have remember, got to be a great friend of mine because I was the only senator who went out. He literally cut a housing unit in half, brought it to Washington, put it on a flatbed from Pine Ridge. And I was the only one who went out and looked at it, right? The only one who, and I'm not criticizing my former colleagues, but, we have just not raised this issue. I mean, my frustration is that this isn't a number one policy concern, whether you're urban, rural, that we don't have the same level of attention to this. We constantly treat the symptoms in this country instead of looking at where does all of this challenge for families begin, and how do we solve that problem? And I think in many ways, it begins and ends with housing. And so we don't have a lot of time left, and I know that I've dominated maybe more than I should have, but I want to make you guys president for the day. And say, okay, you guys are doing great work. You're working the programs, but clean slate. Tell me what you would do to solve the rural housing crisis in America, the tribal housing crisis in America, if you were president of the United States and had unlimited unlimited power. You don't have to go to Congress. We're just going to give you autocratic power to fix housing. What would you do?
If I were both president and all of Congress.
Yeah.
I mean, NLHC's president and CEO, Diane Yantel, often states that as a country, we have the data, partnerships, expertise, proven solutions, and means to end homelessness. We lack only the political will to fund solutions at the scale necessary. So if I were president, I mean, we would, Congress should provide the highest level of investment for federal housing and homelessness programs through appropriations and other means. I mean, investing in affordable housing solutions that target funding to the lowest income households and prevent homelessness, like the Housing Trust Fund, like rural rental assistance in USDA, and other proven solutions end homelessness and housing poverty. This improves lives, it saves the federal government money, and research, like you've hinted at, research clearly demonstrates that housing is inextricably linked to an array of positive outcomes like education, healthcare, economic mobility, economic productivity, and it benefits the whole community. So I think funding would be the first huge step.
Yeah. Robin?
Yes, funding. I mean, that there needs to be more dollars, right? Like I said, I think that the challenge with saying, is there one out of the box solution, is partly that there's just not enough dollars to actually get enough projects built to meet our need. And so if we were able to sort of create or really broaden that pool or move money from one pool, I might move money from one pool in our federal government to more focus on housing. One other thing I think, though, that is really critical is we're asking, and you mentioned this, Senator Heitkamp, earlier, we're asking a lot of our rural communities to be flexible. As Kayla mentioned, all of the folks who lead rural communities or have full-time jobs, these are not paid positions, they have full-time jobs and are doing it in their volunteer time. We're asking them to bend over backwards. And we have federal bureaucracy that is not terribly flexible and does not always work together. Finding ways to have HUD and USDA better work together, making sure that rural communities have the attention of HUD dollars, because HUD is, even though it says urban in that acronym, it is not just exclusive to urban communities. And HUD is also overseeing NAHASDA, which is, as Kayla already mentioned, hugely important for our tribal communities. So finding ways to dismantle some of that bureaucracy and some of that red tape, so you don't need as much technical assistance from folks to navigate all of those systems, and you can access them more readily. I would love to see that happen. If I had the wand to wave, that is one of the things that I would do, is start breaking down the silos, because we have and again, we mentioned about aging in place and Medicaid. You could use Medicaid dollars to subsidize rents and housing units for seniors as they age in place, but it's so hard because the bureaucracies are so enmeshed for those different pots of money. So those are things I would work on.
And Medicaid dollars, actually, as Medicaid and rightfully is looking at the least restrictive environment for people, and how do you, instead of putting people in nursing homes where the cost may be $10,000 a month, for $2,000 a month and a lot of family support, you can maintain someone much cheaper than what we're paying. But again, do they have the right equipment in that house for their disability or for their age? Is there somebody, and these are investments that you can actually make with Medicaid dollars. But I mean, having done this for a friend of mine who's disabled, I mean, the bureaucracy, if he didn't have somebody who was a lawyer, who was, really on his side, he couldn't afford to hire a lawyer to do this work. And I will tell you, in North Dakota, the officials that I worked with were absolutely wonderful, but they had to do their box checking too. And so, it just gets to be this morass of bureaucracy that doesn't really, there's so much embedded costs in bureaucracy that money is not going where it needs to go, which is in direct services. And so the one thing that I want to close with is this is an issue. If anyone out there is listening, is really interested in learning more, interested in participating in advocacy, interested in learning more for their communities, where should they go, Robin and Kayla? How can they continue this conversation to help people in their community and to be better able to be better elected officials or better advocates for rural America?
Yeah, mlhc.org has all of our resources for advocacy. You know, our members are huge, huge range across the housing sector, including rural and native housing advocates. And we are constantly working to build up momentum for Congress to act on these.
Yeah. And our enterprisecommunity.org is our website. Go there. There's a rural and tribal newsletter that we have. You can also reach out directly. I'm really interested in getting engaged and learning more about how we can get engaged at the local level in rural communities to provide and to help think through solutions with communities on the ground. And that's what we're committed to doing day to day. So if you have specific questions or lifting up some sort of solution at your state level, and there might be a way that we can support, we'd love to know and be engaged about it. I'll probably we'll call Kayla and we'll call our friends at Rural LISC and the Housing Assistance Council. We're all working. There's a lot of us working on this issue day to day. And we're really committed to creating better housing outcomes for our rural communities.
Yeah, and what I would suggest to folks who are on, pretty much every state has a housing authority,
Yep.
And they do annual reports, they do annual assessments. A lot of attention right now on homelessness, but this issue of if you're in California or if you're in Illinois, call your housing finance agency, look on the website, find out who's doing that kind of report, what their challenges are. How do they move forward with kind of their advocacy? So I just think this is such an important topic, and it is, as we look at trying to retain population in rural America. I mean, what's more critical than making sure people have a house where if they walk up, they aren't going to fall through the porch? And that's literally the quality of a lot of the housing in rural America. And it's substandard, it's dangerous in a lot of places, and it doesn't leave people with the sense of pride in their communities. And so this is a huge issue. I want to thank both Robin and Kayla. What a great conversation. Hopefully we can continue it at One Country Project, kind of moving forward, provide some additional meat on the bones. But you guys have been absolutely absolutely fabulous panelists. Thank you so much.